So we've just passed the second reset for our new tier, Mount Hyjal and Black Temple, the start of tier 6. That means it's time to review the raid. This is something I have done since Blackwing Lure back during Classic on the channel. We take a delve into the details of the last 2 weeks to find out how hard has the new content been and how many guilds have been able to clear it early on. If you like this idea and want to see more in the future, you can drop a sub on the channel. It's free and it lets me know that. So let me start off by saying, would you believe me if I said that tier 6 has been one of the easiest, most cleared tiers of raiding ever in Classic this early on? Because it has. Let's do a quick trip down memory lane. 2 weeks after Blackwing Lure was out, there were 6,900 clears on the Bad Dragon Nefarian. AQ40, by the end of week 2, players fight an old god, nearly 900 guilds among them were successful. Next, Ramus 40, the peak of vanilla raiding. By the end of the second reset, just north of 300 guilds had landed themselves a killing blow on the Lich Kel'Thuzad. Now, 2 notes for the Classic stats. I was using NA and EU clears only instead of all regions, which kind of scuffed things a little bit, because I realized later on that was going to mess up some search functions that I was using and I had to stop doing it. Nowadays, I search all regions and have done since TBC, so numbers will naturally be much higher, of course. On top of that, Classic raids, don't forget, were 40 man, so 100 clears in Classic with a labor of 400 people. In TBC, that would be 250, another big difference. I didn't cover tier 4 because I don't see the point of covering new expansion raids. Everyone's playing at a different pace and aren't ready for the content. Tier 5, however, was a big shocker, and to this day remains the hardest single tier in Classic to ever exist by a very large margin. Also for TBC, this was the first time we are ever getting pre-nerf raids. Tier 4 had the quote-unquote hardest versions of Magtheridon where you needed a rotation of clickers. Nightbane was a decent fight early on, but it was never really known for its difficulty. And then Tier 5 introduced itself with pre-nerf unCCable mind controls on Lady Vash. Kael'thas with DPS mattered a lot early on to get the advisors positioned, under control and down at the same time, and it proved a genuine challenge, and the few amount of guilds clearing it early on showed that. By the end of week 2 in Tempest Keep, Katie had been defeated just over 2,600 times, and Lady Vash in SSC came out to just under 2,100 kills. Still seems like quite a lot when you consider that Kael'thas was literally not beaten in 2007 before the nerfs that came to the instance in patch 2.1, which also went live for us about 2 weeks before the Black Temple patch. In fact, a few weeks before the nerfs rolled in, there was around a 50-50 split between the guilds that had been successfully clearing all of the tier 5 content and those that were still hitting a roadblock and progressing somewhere, and then after the nerfs everybody just kind of steamrolled the content. At tier 6, Blizzard had a bit of an unclear approach, I think. So tier 6 is not pre-nerf overall. Blizzard said, we did a pretty thorough investigation of the data of each patch between 2.1 and 2.43, as well as looked at public patch notes and just came to the conclusion there wasn't enough of substance for an interesting pre-nerf difficulty. They later went on to clarify there weren't many adjustments made after these raids released in the original Burning Crusade, other than very few minor tweaks and bug fixes, which is true. There were not many mechanical changes to the tier, though I did manage to find this back from 2007, showing that there were some changes which would have made fights considerably harder, most notably on Mother Shiraz, where your tank could get hit by Fatal Attraction. If this happened, people would probably die, and then you would blame bad RNG and not really feel very good about it. Do you remember the mind controls back on Lady Vash? Usually tanks stack in front of a boss to soak a frontal cone called Saber Lash. Fatal Attraction teleported 3 people together, who then have to run apart to break the chains. If your main tank or off tank gets teleported, your main tank could either get one shot, or the boss could run to where they're standing with the other 2 people and cleave them, and just a lot of different things could go wrong, and it would just be put down to bad RNG. Also, the prismatic aura used to adapt depending on the damage taken, not just be random, lowering raid DPS if you class stack too much. Neither of these things are the case anymore. So we do in fact have a somewhat easier, or I guess if you want, quote-unquote fixed version of tier 6, which has no doubt contributed to the number of clears. But let's take a look at some numbers. The first 4 bosses in Hyjal have more or less been cleared by absolutely everybody who's walked into the instance by the look of it. Each of Raged Winterchill, TERON, Khaz'R'gul, and Azalagor have over 14,000 public kill logs. Mount Hyjal is currently in the, well, it's not too bad phase to reclear at the moment. I'm pretty sure in 2 months time I'm going to hope whoever made this place gets there, I get to make raid card, take taken away from them. The next 3 bosses were the starter ones in Black Temple, all having the upper end of 13,000 clears to their name. These were High Warlord Nagentus, Supremus, and the Shade of Akama. Turns out in 2022 the Shade of Akama is not a trash fight either. You activate the boss, pop all your cooldowns, and enjoy your 30-second zero mechanics encounter. Times do indeed change. The following 3 are TERON GOREFIEND with over 13,500 public clears. Turns out people have been practicing the minigame, though with how crazy DPS is these days, only a few people even get the debuff during a fight. You could go the entire of tier 6 with never getting the debuff. I actually would not be surprised, and the rest of the fight is just a big target dummy. Our commander's next, equally with over 13,000 clears. This boss is a test of one very important skill. Can you not die? As soon as somebody dies, it can start a chain reaction that wipes out your raid in moments if he gets a nasty soul charge buff. Just don't forget your tier of Balloon, don't stand in the giant fiery walls of fire, hit the boss and collect your loot. Gertog Blood Boil has less clears than Archimond apparently. Pretty fun boss, and one person gets chosen to go god mode and pass as well. Hopefully it just doesn't land on a healer though. Reliquary is next with just under 13,000 clears. Can't wait to see people global themselves with cooldowns up when we have more tier 6 gear. That's going to be the main entertainment on this encounter. The cause of much worry for Shadow Resist is not much for worry after all. Many people opted for only 2 to 3 pieces of pure Shadow Resist items, the neck, the cloak, and maybe the bracers, with some old tier mixed in with resistance gems. Mother Shiraz saw just over 12,000 clears and was quite a cheesable boss as well. It has a nasty knock-up that's meant to punish players from stacking, but what if the entire raid stacked somewhere where you could not be knocked up? People did it back in 2007, and wouldn't you know it, they're still doing it now. Which means the second hardest boss of the tier was the ILLIDARI Council with just over 11,400 clears. A relatively complicated encounter actually at first glance, with a lot going on at once that needs to be broken down into individual responsibilities between mage tanking, targeting heals when people spike on damage, tank positioning, and interrupts. Pretty fun overall though, and drops some really good loot. And finally, the real boss of tier 6, or is he so much? ILLIDAN saw 10,673 clears after the second reset. A multi-phase encounter, though he doesn't quite have the payoff that he did in TBC. DPS standards are so high now that you can totally skip the demon phase if you push enough, which completely trivializes one of the harder parts of the fight because it just doesn't happen. The other hard part of the fight are the elementals, because your tank probably can't see anything on the screen as it's just different shades of fire. Oh, and of course he drops orange weapons, the glaives, and you bet everybody that's gotten lucky has to let you know in your guild, your server, the forums, and of course Reddit. They are after all a 5% drop rate, or so I hear, and with over 10,000 guilds clearing, that's 500 green swords in the game already. At least 500 in fact. So overall we have a massive volume of players clearing tier 6. On Ironforge.pro we're seeing a strong surge of players for the new content who are getting stuck in, and perhaps more importantly, actually clearing it, with some 355,000 active raiders the last reset worldwide. Tier 5 may have been off-putting to many after nights of wiping on Vash or KT. Tier 6 is quite the opposite, and it appears as though the majority have been able to work their way through the content by this early stage. I don't think there's too much mechanically difficult in the tier, and I believe that the quote-unquote hardest fights are almost entirely tank positioning fights, especially ILLIDARI Council and Illidan. If a tank does something wrong, you can wipe very easily. Loot is always a big incentive for the classic player base as well, and tier 6 is absolutely packed with really good items for everybody, between strong tier sets for your warlocks or hunters, trinkets like the Skull of Gul'dan or Madness of the Betrayer, weapons like Bristle Blitz Striker, Cataclysm's Edge, Torch of the Damned, and of course glaives, and so many good off pieces. There just feels like there is more to the phase loot-wise. Also, 2 new stats get heavily pushed this tier which really affect the performance of many classes, those being the new Ignore Armor stat and Spell Haste. I think people are really interested in those as well. The price of raiding has come down a lot as well. Marks of the ILLIDARI have started dropping in tier 5 and 6, which can be exchanged for flasks. I don't know about your server, we have seen flasks come down so much that I'm even considering using them on leveling alts now. And finally, of course, it's Illidan, it's the Black Temple. This raid is really famous, if not for the bosses and the loot, for the lore and the story that led up to this place, all the way from the RTS games to where we are now. I think a lot of players are ticking this off their to-do list. Blizzard have confirmed they will be doing pre-nerf Sunwell at this point in time, so we very well may see a return to harder content when that releases. In fact, I think it will be a lot more difficult than current tier 6 will be, but for the time being, the start of tier 6 is here, the loot is flowing, and the bosses are not providing a huge challenge overall. And I get a feeling that more people prefer shiny perps and clearing with the boys rather than challenging content. So let me know your thoughts on tier 6 so far, how it's gone for you and your guild. There's going to be plenty of it left, don't you worry about that. Oh, and I guess there's also Zul'Aman before Sunwell as well. I assume that will be pre-nerf. Time will tell. That's about all though. As always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you all in the next one very soon.